Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the Education Specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today and joining us for this lunchtime presentation. Today we have Kenneth Smith Jr. with us. But before we get started, I just want to say a quick thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support. All this free programming that we get to do, both virtually and in-house, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. So thank you to them, and also thank you to their sponsor, Generac Power System. Without those two entities, we would not be able to put on all the free programming that we do here at the museum. So big kudos to both of our sponsors, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and Generac Power Systems, for their support. Today, we are welcoming to the program Mr. Kenneth Smith Jr. Kenneth Smith Jr. earned his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. And he also earned a Master's of Public Affairs from the La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and also a Master's in Urban Planning and Regional Planning, also from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He currently lives and works in Milwaukee, and he's here today to talk with us about the long shadow of the Cold War, Milwaukee's Civil Defense Program. Ken, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So let me get the...
Yeah, you go right ahead, sir. The floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you.
And as Ken's getting his PowerPoint and everything up, if I could just remind our audience members, we do have our safety features turned on, so you'll not be able to ask questions audibly, but you can always submit those questions via the chat function to either myself or Ms. Jen Carlson that you see on the screen there. We will put all the questions together in a PowerPoint and bring those up at the end and display those for both the audience and the presenter. So if you do have any questions, please be sure to put those in the chat function, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the program. Ken's got his PowerPoint ready to go. He's ready to go. Ken, the floor is yours, sir.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And so this is the long shadow of the Cold War, Milwaukee's Civil Defense Program. This presentation is based off of an article I wrote for the Wisconsin Magazine of History, which in turn was based off of research I did as an undergraduate working on my history degree at UW Eau Claire. And so what is civil defense? Well, I was born at the tail end of the Cold War, and so I have no memory of it personally. And so when I thought of civil defense, I had vague memories of duck and cover, fallout shelters. You think Bert the Turtle. If you haven't seen the 1950s cartoon with Bert the Turtle, duck and cover, I highly encourage it. It's on YouTube. But as I began looking at what civil defense was in Milwaukee, I learned more about how it was protecting the public during wartime and safeguarding industry. Now, most of the audience probably knows what the Cold War is, but I'll just cover my bases. So just so everyone's on the same page, the Cold War was, of course, a geopolitical conflict between the American and Soviet spheres of influence, West versus East, right after World War II. And it was also an ideological conflict between market capitalism and command economy communism. And so before there was Cold War civil defense, there was civil defense. And before I really started delving in this topic, I hadn't really thought about it, but then understood that civil defense is a concept that's been around a lot longer than some of us may have thought. It goes back to World Wars I and II, and the whole idea is having a public, formal or informal infrastructure to respond to a wartime crisis. Think the Battle of Britain, with the London Blitz. You had everyday Londoners who were assisting the first responders in responding to damage to buildings, fires, evacuating people, that sort of thing. And it's interesting in the grand scope of American history, in that the idea of having a sort of public disaster relief organization, you don't really see that until the early 20th century. And in fact, there's a book written by Patrick S. Roberts called Disasters in the American State. The second chapter covers the whole time period of 1789 to 1914, and 1914 being, of course, when World War I began. And why is that? Well, it's part of American history in that there was initially an ideological opposition to having a strong centralized government to do things such as providing disaster relief. That doesn't mean that disaster relief didn't happen prior to World War I, but it happened on an ad hoc basis, and it still had a lot of resistance due to that historical bias toward favoring self-reliance, toward having states and local governments handle things on their own without the help of the federal government. Of course, there may be some crises that are just too enormous for a local area or even a state government to be able to handle, and that's why we would have the federal government come in. And so looking back at World War I and World War II civil defense, this is a really great poster from, this is a World War II era poster, and it may be curious. You may wonder, why is everything blacked out? And then, there's the hand that says conserve and protect. Well, this was in New York City, and you may recall, for those of you who know your World War II history, that when German U-boats came to American shores to attack American shipping, the New York City skyline lit up trade ships like a Christmas tree. And so they had to have blackouts in many cities, such as New York City, to ensure that American shipping wouldn't be easy targets for German U-boats. And the poster is calling out that one building owner who isn't turning off the lights, and thereby hurting the war effort. Another interesting thing about civil defense history is the social aspect to it. It was a way for people to come together for the common good and, well, socialize. And these are two Wisconsin Historical Society photos of a civil defense rally, a World War II civil defense rally in Greendale. And if I had to guess, it looks like that's Daffodil Park, for those of you who know the area. I used to live in Greendale, so I know it quite well. But it's interesting, you can see they're serving beer at a civil defense rally and ice cream. And so now that we have that background knowledge out of the way, let's steer toward Milwaukee and Mayor Frank Zeiler. So having a little bit of background knowledge about him will help us move forward. So he was the third and last socialist mayor of Milwaukee. His tenure was 1948 to 1960. And he largely continued the socialist tradition, the Milwaukee socialist tradition of clean government and efficient government. And he is perhaps most well known, or at least perhaps his greatest lasting legacy, was nearly doubling the acreage of the city of Milwaukee. And he saw the writing on the wall with suburbanization, and he tried to counter the tax base leaving the historic city by expanding the city. And so that is perhaps his greatest initiative. But of course, the topic of today is not urban expansion, it's civil defense. And Mayor Zeiler had a large role in civil defense, as you will see. Now, when he became mayor in 1948, Milwaukee was a much different city than you may realize compared to today. In 1950, Milwaukee was the 13th most populous city at around 637,000 people, and it was an incredibly industrial city. I would say the city still retains its industrial base and its heritage, but back then it was much, much, much more so. So what made Frank Zeiler interested in civil defense? Well, it wasn't the Cold War. It was actually the Texas City disaster. And some of you may have heard of it, but the Texas City's disaster occurred on April 16th, 1947. And roughly 3,000 tons of fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate exploded. And this may have been caused by dock workers smoking, but the fires quickly spread to other containers, and it created explosion after explosion after explosion. And as you can see here, it was nothing small. It was among the worst disasters in American history, and around 560 people died with 3,000 injured, at least 3,000. It destroyed Texas City's port, a Monsanto factory, and around 500 homes. some cargo was reportedly hurled 2 miles away. And as Frank Zeiler was entering his term of office as mayor of Milwaukee, he feared something like that could happen to Milwaukee. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Milwaukee was an industrial city, a very industrial city. It once called it the machine shop of the world. And around 1950, around 56% of Milwaukee workers were employed in manufacturing. So it's not difficult to see, Mayor Zeiler's position on the issue. But of course, some things changed. And so while he began working on civil defense for disaster response, the Cold War was really starting to heat up along with the Red Scare. In 1948 to 1949, there was the Berlin blockade. And that was when Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin blocked Allied access to West Berlin. And so that the response to that was the Berlin airlift, where many planes were flying in supplies to West Berlin to ensure that West Berlin would not be choked off. And followed by, there was also the Soviet atomic bomb. That was the loss of the United States nuclear monopoly, followed by the fall of China. That's when Mao Zedong's communist forces took control of the mainland China, and the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan. And of course, the Korean War started in 1950. And those of you familiar with the concept of the domino theory, people were afraid that communism would keep spreading and spreading and spreading. And so while these things were heating up, there became a great fear. And the greatest fear for our purposes for emergency defense or emergency response and civil defense was the nuclear weapons. The United States had lost its nuclear monopoly, and coming off of World War II was a total war in which all of society was put toward meeting the needs of the war to become victorious. And we also saw in these total wars the bombing of industrial centers of production, of populations. Both the Allies and the Axis countries did this to varying degrees. We carpet bombed German cities, firebombed Japanese cities, and there were, of course, the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But likewise, the Germans targeted London and other British population centers. And so, in the wake of World War II and this understanding of total war, the fact that one nuclear weapon could destroy an entire city was something a big city mayor like Frank Zeiler would be concerned about. And certainly other big city mayors were concerned about that as well. And so, and one other thing to add is that politicians in Washington also needed to use civil defense to justify the US containment strategy of the communist countries. And for the first time in American history, the US would employ a large peacetime army, which historically that was anathema to the American idea. Going back to the American War for Independence, one of the causes for that war was the posting of British soldiers in American homes and the fear of a standing army. So what is a civilian mayor to do to respond to a potential nuclear attack? Well, there are basically three main strategies. Urban decentralization or dispersion is a long-term strategy. So think suburbanization. You're spreading your facilities out. And the other two more immediate responses to a pending nuclear attack would be the use of fallout shelters and evacuation. Oh, let me go back. And so what's interesting doing my research, I found that the Zeiler administration really became a leader and a pioneer in civil defense planning. Milwaukee officials testified before Congress in 1950 and 1956. Their research and their experimentation led to two Federal Civil Defense Administration technical manuals, and they were called Procedure for Evacuation Traffic Movement Studies and Planning and Organizing for Civil Defense Traffic Operations. And so As it sounds, as you can tell, the Zeiler administration favored evacuation. So, and in doing so, he was able to also speak. Zeiler spoke as a keynote speaker at a December 1954 National Security Conference. He spoke along with President Dwight Eisenhower, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the Federal Civil Defense Administration Administrator Val Peterson, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Arthur Redford. And what's interesting is I also came across this in the testimony from 1956. Major Ralph J. Olson, who was with the State Office of Civil Defense, the Wisconsin Office of Civil Defense, and Colonel John Fitzpatrick, they said on June 25th, 1956, some cities and communities in building up civil defense have been fortunate in possessing strong leadership. Such a city is Milwaukee, which has been in the forefront in creating a practical civil defense organization. Chief credit for this goes to Mayor Frank Zeiler, who has consistently supported and worked to implement civil defense wherever possible. And so, favoring evacuation, there were 4 generic phases of this evacuation. One was the strategic phase, a time of heightened international crisis. Next, the tactical phase, which was, quote, a general and orderly evacuation, and then followed by reception and care. This is when rescue services would move in when it was safe to do so. And finally, a return to the city. This would be after radiation subsides and reconstruction can begin. Now, since Zeiler was so heavily involved in pushing for these civil defense efforts, he was invited to view a nuclear detonation. And so the detonation he observed was Operation Tumbler Snapper Shot Charlie. Now, some background about Operation Tumbler Snapper, that was a series of nuclear detonations where the US military actually experimented with movement during a nuclear war. And this Shot Charlie saw many mayors, many political figures, and the press to come view this exercise and the detonation. And upon seeing this detonation, Frank Zeiler was redoubled his efforts, I should say, in pushing for evacuation over fallout shelters, because fallout shelters were expensive, and how can you build your way out of an explosion that can destroy your city? And so just more background information. So that this occurred at the Nevada Proving Grounds, and this is in the desert about 75 miles northwest of Las Vegas. And the explosion you can see here had a 31 kiloton yield. That's about 50% stronger than the Hiroshima bomb, which was about 15 kilotons. And mind you, this compared to more modern nuclear weapons, it's a pea shooter because modern nuclear weapons are generally measured in megatons. And so a kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT, the equivalent yield. And of course, a megaton is 1,000,000 tons of TNT. So the bombs get progressively more powerful. And so this particular explosion was seen 400 miles away in Idaho, and the blast was reportedly felt 120 miles away in St. George, Utah. Now, I have a friend who lives in St. George, Utah, and he says that back then and even now today, as a joke, the folks in St. George call themselves downwinders because they were always downwind of the explosion, and they probably got their fair share of radiation from these explosions. And so, as you can see here, civil defense planning became quite robust. This is the presumed detonation pattern of a 20 megaton blast affecting the center, the downtown of Milwaukee County and the city of Milwaukee, as well as other blast areas. So, if you're trying to evacuate the city, you need to make sure that you are out of the blast area and the area of the radius of radiation spread. A fun picture that this is Kilburn Avenue downtown. You can see the Milwaukee County Courthouse in the background. This just goes to show the great organization and infrastructure built up to respond to a nuclear attack should it occur in Milwaukee. you can see City Hall in the background. This is another civil defense truck, a rescue service. And to have evacuation, you need to have evacuation routes. And so in the foreground of this picture, you can see an old evacuation route sign on Wisconsin 41. And so an aspect of civil defense to try to get people to be more involved in civil defense and to have fallout shelters in their basement was triggering fear. And so this picture is of, I can't recall, it's either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but could this happen to Milwaukee? And so it could in light of Cold War conditions. So you should do something about it. You should volunteer. And another way that people participated as volunteers were ground observers. So, watching the night skies or the day skies for enemy planes. And there was a ground observer corps in Green Bay and a ground observer corps in Madison, to provide early warning for Milwaukee and Chicago. This would, of course, become obsolete once NORAD was developed. So you may be thinking, is this really going to work? And well, people back then thought that too. There was an inherent paradox with nuclear preparedness. So the question is, should policymakers spend money on civil defense or should they spend it on the military? And the politicians thought that they should put more of their resources in the military to try to deter any sort of enemy aggression. But the problem is, in trying to get people to prepare for nuclear war by themselves, many people just felt like they couldn't be bothered. And so another contradiction is that you should prepare for nuclear war because it's going to be really bad, but the military will protect you. And so that many people just couldn't be bothered. And especially as the technology to deliver nuclear weapons improved, and it would be nuclear missiles could arrive faster and faster, and the potency of nuclear bombs became more powerful. It just became less of an incentive to do anything, because if you're going to die, you're going to die. Otherwise, hopefully, there won't be nuclear war. And in my opinion, one of the most intriguing aspects of Cold War civil defense were these operation alerts. Now, these were drills held annually over the course of the 1950s. And it was a sort of war game. And the sociologist Guy Oakes described it perhaps the best. He called it, quote, an elaborate national sociodrama which combined elements of mobilization for war, disaster relief, the church social, summer camp, and the county fair. And he later wrote also, each operation alert was designed as a play in the sense of both an exercise and a drama. The drama was framed as a grand national epic in the style of MGM movie epics so popular in the 1950s. Following the logic of nuclear crisis mastery, the plot of the drama moved from threat to crisis to resolution. Naturally, the American people emerged from the radioactive mists of nuclear war essentially unchanged, if not altogether unscathed. In the article in the Wisconsin Magazine of History, I delve into this deeper and analyzing Operation Alert 1957. But what I can say, the SparkNotes version, is the outcomes were overly optimistic and everything went right. If you look at natural disasters that occur or even man-made disasters, there are so many variables that you just can't plan for it, even if you have a robust infrastructure. And so this was another paradox inherent to civil defense planning. But as you can see here, these are images from Milwaukee's civil defense. These images are from Operation Alert 1958. They did not make the cut into the magazine, but they're fun images. And so the image you can see on the left here with the helicopter, this was at the Indian Mound Reservation outside of Delafield. Excuse me, that's Oconomowoc. Likewise, you can see the trailer with the truck trailer with the City of Milwaukee's control unit. I believe that picture was taken at, yeah, it's the Alternate Control Center. So this would have been at the Indian Mound Reservation as well. And the city of Milwaukee had a headquarters in exile, if you will, that at St. John's Military Academy in Delafield. And in the bottom right, you can see the Common Council convening a meeting, you know, during this Operation Alert. However, you know, as I've alluded to before, as technology improved, the delivery systems became faster and nuclear weapons became more powerful. The efficacy of civil defense seemed in doubt to a lot of people. You know, in November 1954, the Federal Civil Defense Administration claimed that Milwaukee could evacuate 800,000 people in 3 hours. However, in December, at that conference I mentioned earlier, Mayor Zeiler lamented it would take 7 to 8 hours to evacuate Milwaukee. And this is, of course, assuming that these would be Soviet bombers coming for Milwaukee and not an ICBM. And so realistically, they estimated that there would only be 2 hours notice of a Soviet attack. And of course, with the advent of ICBMs, you know, you'd have even less notice. And so, of course, in 1957, that was the launch of Sputnik. And the launch of Sputnik showed that the Soviets could launch a missile that would attack US cities. You know, that was arguably the impetus behind the use of Sputnik, was demonstrating that. And you see that with other countries even today. They're demonstrating their ability to launch missiles vis-a-vis their space programs. And so, yeah, during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, they saw the writing on the wall as well. A 1960 Federal Office of Civil Defense paper wrote, quote, "Our imagination could not encompass the situation which would result from an attack on this country involving the explosion of 2,000 megatons." Remember, 1 megaton is 1 million tons of TNT. And so in response to this, President Eisenhower reportedly responded, "War no longer has any logic whatsoever." So the idea is that any sort of nuclear war would be the end of the world. And so therefore, with this idea of mutually assured destruction, they had to ensure that there would never be a nuclear war. And the reason why I chose this picture is it shows a Nike missile site. This is on the site of the current Summerfest grounds. For those of you who have been, the Milwaukee area had at one time 8 Nike missile sites ringing the city. A fun aspect of this picture is in the corner to the left, you can see the Northwestern Mutual headquarters, as well as right behind the missile, you can also see the Cudahy Tower, for those of you familiar with Milwaukee. And so as the justification for civil defense seemed less and less as time went on, as the technology of delivery systems and potency of nuclear weapons grew, steadily, slowly but surely, civil defense got budget cuts. However, it was not to say that civil defense didn't have any use whatsoever. Civil defense, when it was known as that, was also used to respond to natural disasters. And so it evolved into what we now call emergency management, with the thinking generally going that, you know, while you may not be able to adequately respond to a full-blown nuclear war, it is nice to have a generic infrastructure to respond to emergencies as they occur, and to have people that think about, you know, if something goes wrong, what do we do to try to mitigate that problem? And so subsequently, FEMA was created in 1990 as an independent agency. However, going back decades, you know, there was the evolution from civil defense to emergency management. And you also see the state organization as well as Milwaukee County's Office of Emergency Management as an example. And so if you're interested in reading more and learning more, this is the article. It's from the spring 2021 issue of the Wisconsin Magazine of History. I delve into more details on Operation Alert, on the politics behind civil defense in Milwaukee and Wisconsin and nationally. And if you're interested in reading more on the topic, here's some suggested reading. Making Milwaukee Mightier has a focus on urban planning, but a significant portion of the book is devoted to civil defense, because there was an interplay between civil defense and urban planning during the Zeiler administration. The Imaginary War and Civil Defense Begins at Home. Those books cover the Cold War culture and the idea behind self-help and trying to respond to a nuclear war should it occur. And the book Disasters in the American State is more or less just a policy history showing the evolution of how the federal government acquired more responsibility in disaster responses, as well as the evolution of civil defense into emergency management. And so with that, I am open to any questions. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
That was awesome, Ken. And it was just so surreal seeing that Nike AA missile right there at the Summerfest grounds. I mean, I'm there every summer to watch my favorite acts, and you just never would have suspected something like that sitting there. It's just, it was kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, it is one of my favorite images from the Cold War era of the city.
Yeah, it's like having something, you know, in the middle of Disneyland or just somewhere where you don't expect, you know, our nation's nuclear capabilities to be, you know, focused or what have you. It seems like more of a fun, relaxing family place, but I guess not always, huh?
Yeah.
We do have some questions from the audience, and I'll start with the last one that just came in because I didn't get it up onto the PowerPoint in time. But in the early 1980s, President Reagan tried to invigorate and update the civil defense plans. What and how seriously did Milwaukee respond to this renewed civil defense effort in the 80s?
So that's a good question. That's outside of the scope of what I studied. I focused on the late 40s and into the 60s. And so I don't have the information to answer that question.
And I'll bring up the other questions that we had. The first question, can you see the questions there, Ken?
Yes.
Perfect. What was the purpose of the civil defense rallies that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation? Was it to raise awareness, or was it for fundraising, or kind of like a bond sale, sort of bond drive?
Yeah, it was more so raising awareness and building a sense of common cause and community. I don't know if fundraising occurred. Very likely it did. I have not seen any direct evidence of that, though. And so it's the idea of instilling community and, you know, going back to the idea of a community fighting a total war. You know, in London during the Blitz, you had civil defenders helping first responders address people trapped in buildings, putting out fires, clearing rubble out of the streets. And so this was sort of a peacetime way of trying to do that. Of course, you know, in peacetime, there isn't the urgency that there is in wartime. And just like looking at current events with what's happening in Ukraine, I don't know if they have formal organizations devoted to civil defense or what we could call civil defense, but no doubt they have informal structures that exist among the civilian population to assist the first responders so that, you know, people can contribute to the war effort in what's going on right now.
The next question, Ken. Here we go. Did you find anything in your research as to why Mayor Zeiler was so instrumental in leading the civil defense planning as opposed to mayors of other major cities such as New York or Los Angeles?
You know, it just became his baby. And so, you know, I didn't mention in the presentation, but it's in the article to an extent, and more so in my undergraduate research. You know, he saw the problem that occurred in the Texas City disaster, problem to say the least. He thought that could happen in Milwaukee with the level of industry in the city at the time. And so he wanted to do something about it. And so beginning in 1948, when he took office, his administration was focusing on disaster relief, disaster response. And they believed at the time, and based on the documentation, that they were ahead of the curve. No one else was doing it. And then, of course, that evolved very quickly into Cold War civil defense with the threat of nuclear war and just the Cold War in general. And so it's something he wanted to do, and it was something that he prioritized. And for that, he was recognized for it.
Yeah, it's awesome that he was leading that charge. You would think that it would come from a different major city, not Milwaukee, maybe one on the coast. But yeah, that's emergency preparedness is always something that we have to look out for.
Yeah, well, and don't forget, Milwaukee in 1950 was the 13th most populous city in the country, and in 1970, Milwaukee was the 10th most populous city. And so I forgot to mention earlier, but yeah, for comparison, in 2020, Fort Worth, Texas was either 10th or 13th largest. Oh, excuse me, it was the 13th largest city in the country. And so Milwaukee had a greater prominence at the time than it enjoys now, just due to population shifts and where industry has gone.
The next question. If the citizens of Milwaukee did have to evacuate, where might they have gone?
Yeah, good question. So I was unable to secure the permission to use the map image. If you look at the article, you can see it online, you can see the map. And so basically, depending on where you lived in Milwaukee County, you would have traveled west or north or northwest. And they avoided going south because people evacuating from Chicago would be coming north. And so I can't recall off the top of my head where exactly, but it would have been basically out of the blast radius, out of the radius that would have been exposed to radiation, or what they believed would have been exposed.
Sure. Did the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis have a direct effect on the city of Milwaukee civil defense planning going forward, especially with respect to the evacuation plan?
And so, by 1962, civil defense was sort of on the wane. Even if you look at the federal expenditures, there was a spike around the time of the Berlin crisis. You may know, the showdown at Checkpoint Charlie. Perhaps you remember the famous pictures of U.S. tanks staring down Russian tanks in Berlin. And then shortly thereafter was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there was a small spike in funding, and I didn't see anything noticeable in Milwaukee based on the documents I've seen. And in the grand scheme of things, the Cuban Missile Crisis was 11 days, I think. And so, it's a blip on the radar, even though it was, of course, was a very significant event and perhaps the closest we've ever come to nuclear annihilation. But civil defense existed and it continued. And for example, there was a full-page ad taken out, actually an entire section in the Milwaukee Journal was paid by Milwaukee County government showing where various fallout shelters were in Milwaukee County, and also showing what government was doing to address other sorts of natural disasters. And so it never went away, but it didn't enjoy the prominence that it had in the 1950s.
On to the next question. How many of Milwaukee's citizens were volunteers for the civil defense program? I don't know if you came across any of that in your research at all.
So that's a really good question. I have not come across any solid numbers. However, there were never enough people interested. I talk about this in the article. Some civil defense drills were canceled because more people wanted to go to a high school graduation than work on civil defense. People didn't really think of it as their problem. Just let the government take care of it. And so that goes back to the paradox of civil defense, that the military's got it, we don't need to worry about that. And so very few people were really interested in doing that. They were okay with the federal government doing stuff and state and local governments working on civil defense, but that's a government thing.
Not a citizenry issue, right?
Yeah.
Were the operation alerts that you spoke about, were they limited to a regional level, or did they conduct nationwide operation alerts?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, they were conducted nationally, and it was either 1954 or 1955. Even the president participated in it, and so yes, they did occur concurrently, but it was everyone kind of doing their own thing to an extent. And in Operation Alert 1957, which I write about in the article, Milwaukee decided to kind of do their own thing. They threw out what the federal government was doing, and they decided, oh, we're going to do this instead. And so that caused some confusion between some other regional actors. And so there was finger pointing and yelling, and it was all reported in the press, which makes for fun reading and writing for a historian.
And then last comment is not really a question, it's more of a comment, but one of our audience members remembers growing up in the 50s as a Boy Scout, and the Boy Scouts here in Madison were recruited to be on-ground observers, and they would post themselves on the roof of the YWCA at the corner of Mifflin and Pinckney. So that's just kind of an interesting little fact that you know, some of our audience members do know exactly what you're talking about. They lived it. They went and stood up on the rooftop of the YWCA and made sure the skies were clear. I can't imagine having to do that as a young Boy Scout. But you know, desperate times call for desperate measures, and anything that we could do to keep safe, I guess that's what we do, huh?
Yeah, no, that picture that I showed earlier of the Ground Observer Corps, that was taken in Madison. I can't recall if the photo stated exactly where in Madison, but that very well may have been on top of the YWCA building. And so it's pretty wild.
Well, Ken, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a fantastic presentation, and it just gives us a bit more of our Wisconsin history and our Milwaukee history that we don't normally get, or that we really don't even, you know, hear about too much. So it was nice, kind of just a nice piece of that history that we're just, you know, basically turned on to. And we do appreciate everything that you've done for your article and for joining us here today. And if you could just hang on, I do want to speak with you just for a few minutes afterwards. We appreciate it. We hope that you will come back and join us for more of our virtual and our in-person events. You can find those always at wizvetsmuseum.com. That's where we have all of our event listings at. And so we hope to see you at some more of our upcoming events. Ken, thank you. Our audience, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see everybody next time.